I still remember the smell of lilies in the hospital room, the same flowers my dad loved. He was lying there, lifeless, and the world I knew ended that day. My name is Emma, and if you told me back then that my biggest enemy wouldn't be some stranger, but my own mother, I would have laughed in your face. Dad's death shattered me, but it didn't even make Mom flinch. 2 weeks after his funeral, while I was still trying to breathe without crying, she showed up at breakfast wearing a diamond ring I'd never seen before. "I'm getting remarried," she said, sipping her coffee like she was announcing a vacation. I stared at her. "What? Already?" "Oh, Emma," she sighed, pretending to care. "Life goes on. You'll understand someday." But I did understand, too well. Dad's company, his estate, everything he'd built over 35 years was now in her hands, and it didn't take long before I realized she had no plans to share any of it with me. I started noticing documents disappearing from Dad's office, bank accounts being drained. Even my childhood home was suddenly listed for sale. But the final blow came when I overheard a phone call she thought I couldn't hear. She whispered, "Once the will is revised, Emma won't get a single cent. Then we can finally live the life we deserve." We? Who was we? And why did it sound like she'd been planning this all along? The betrayal was bad enough, but the truth was poison. Dad never knew that Mom had been cheating on him for years. I did. I found the messages, the photos, the hotel bookings. I stayed silent because I thought it would kill him if he knew. But now she was trying to erase me. And that's when I made a decision. I wasn't going to cry. I wasn't going to beg. I was going to destroy her plan, piece by piece. And to do that, I'd need help from someone who knew how to uncover the ugliest secrets people tried to bury. The night after I heard that call, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mom's cold smile. The same smile she'd used to tuck me into bed as a child, now twisted into something darker. If she thought she could erase me from Dad's legacy, she had no idea who she was dealing with. The next morning, I called the only person I trusted with something like this, Liam Carter, an old friend from college who now worked as a private investigator in Toronto. We hadn't spoken in months, but as soon as he heard my voice, he knew something was wrong. "Emma, what's going on?" he asked. "I need you to find everything you can on my mother. Finances, property, phone records, everything," I said. My voice didn't even sound like mine. It was colder, sharper, and I need it fast. Liam hesitated. "That's a heavy request. You sure you want to go down this road?" "More than anything," I whispered. Within days, Liam was deep into the investigation, and what he found made my stomach turn. Mom hadn't just been cheating, she had been funneling Dad's money into offshore accounts for years. The man she planned to marry? A con artist with a trail of bankrupt ex-wives across 3 states. But that wasn't all. 2 weeks before Dad's death, Mom had persuaded him to change parts of his will, conveniently the parts that protected my share of the inheritance. It was legal, but it was evil. "Emma," Liam said one evening, sliding a folder across the cafe table, "this is enough to blow everything up. But if you go public, there's no turning back." I looked at the documents. Bank transfers, love letters, falsified signatures. My heart pounded. This wasn't just betrayal. This was premeditated destruction. "I don't want to go public," I said slowly, my voice steady for the first time in weeks. "I want her to watch everything she built burn, and know it was me." The plan was simple, but ruthless. I would use her secrets against her, one by one, until she had no allies left. She had taken everything from me. Now, I was going to take everything from her. I told Liam exactly what I wanted. No theatrics, no messy shouting matches. Just truth, folded into a form that would crush her quietly but utterly. He understood. He already had a dossier on the man my mother planned to marry, a smooth-talking Daniel Reed who'd left a ruin of canceled businesses and angry creditors across 3 provinces. He was practiced at charm, practiced at theft. He was also arrogant enough to think he could handle whatever came his way. We set the meeting like this. Emma, calm, composed, daughter looking for answers. Daniel, confident, ready to charm. And a quiet camera placed where no one would see it. I wore the face I had rehearsed all week, the one that said I was fragile, grief-struck, and utterly dependent on my mother. I wanted him to underestimate me. Daniel, I began, keeping the voice small, I just want to understand. How did you and Mom meet? What are your plans with the house? He smiled that slick smile and began his performance. Lovely words about stability, helping my mother, and how he only wanted what was best for the family. He talked like a man who sold dreams for a living. Then, casually, I mentioned a name I'd found in his paperwork, a creditor in Vancouver who'd filed complaints the previous year. His smile faltered for the first time. He stammered, recalibrated. I pressed a little harder, as if confused and naive. I read something. Are you really divorced, or are you still involved? That tiny question hooked him. He tried to recover, to laugh it off, but Liam's camera had already captured the micro-expressions, the twitch of a finger, the way his jaw clenched when he lied. After another minute, I let a single document slide from my bag, a faded email printout Liam had unearthed, showing Daniel negotiating fees for asset management with an offshore account. The color drained from his face. "Where did you get that?" he hissed. "From someone who cares about the family," I said softly, and for the first time the room felt very small. Daniel's charm cracked into something raw. He leaned forward, anger and fear mixed, and said things under his breath meant only for me. I let him. I wanted proof of motive. I wanted him to show his hand. He did. He admitted, in the quiet heat of the conversation, that he'd suggested changes to the will and simplified some accounts while my father was ill. He didn't know he was speaking to a camera. He didn't know his voice would be proof. When I walked out of that meeting, my hands were shaking, but the tremor wasn't from fear. It was from power. Liam's recorder had everything. The man who thought he'd married into an unguarded estate had just confessed to the very schemes he intended to profit from. I sent the footage to a trusted lawyer and to one cautious bank contact Liam had cultivated. I didn't post anything online. I didn't need to. I kept the leverage close, like a loaded spring. My mother would soon discover the chain she'd pulled tight. Daniel's arrogance had just given me the rope. Next, I told Liam we needed to hit her where it hurt most, her reputation in the tight circle of our family and the financial institutions that still trusted her. But first, there was a single phone call I had to make that would change everything. When Liam slid the recorder's file across the table, I felt a cold clarity settle over me. Daniel's confession was a weapon, but weapons only work if you know where to aim. We needed institutions that would act, banks that would freeze accounts, lawyers who would file emergency injunctions, and relatives who would finally see the pattern instead of her rehearsed lines. First, I called the one bank manager I'd quietly cultivated a relationship with over the years, Mrs. Alvarez, who had handled my father's accounts with a gentle professionalism that felt like an ally. I asked to meet her in person and, without dramatics, placed Daniel's footage on her desk. I watched the color drain from her cheeks as she listened. When the file ended, she didn't say much. She simply slid her phone to me, showing the flagged transfer list. Multiple wire-outs timed suspiciously around the dates my mother had taken Dad to medical appointments. "We'll place immediate holds," she said, voice low, "but we'll need legal authorization to prevent any tampering. Do you have your father's original will?" I did. I produced the folder I'd rescued from his study, the one copy she'd assumed was safe. Mrs. Alvarez promised to start paperwork. She also told me quietly what none of the relatives had wanted to admit. Banks move on evidence, not gossip. Liam's footage and the signed transfers were exactly the kind of evidence they could act on. Next, I arranged a quiet lunch with Aunt Clara and two cousins who'd always defended Mom's choices. I didn't throw accusations. Instead, I walked them through questions, casual, curious, surgical. "Did you notice how Mom suddenly stopped attending Dad's meetings?" I asked. "Did you ever see any receipts or statements from that investment she mentioned?" Their faces shifted, small fissures forming where their defense once stood. Word travels faster than you'd expect in families. My mother, sensing a change, tried to speed up her plans. She suggested finalizing changes to the will at her lawyer's office under the pretense of clarifying affairs. She thought she could outpace bureaucracy. She miscalculated. On the day she planned to sign, she arrived in silk and perfume, radiant with the arrogance of someone who believed the house of cards was already built. I sat quietly beside her, hands folded, my expression the practiced grief of weeks. Inside my bag, Liam's backup drive hummed like a tiny heartbeat. When her lawyer asked about the recent transfers, I let Mrs. Alvarez's letter and Liam's footage speak first. The lawyer's smile tightened into confusion. The air in the room shifted the way a storm shifts light. Suddenly, everyone in it knew we were no longer playing by her rules. She looked at me then, that same woman who used to tuck me into bed, and for the first time I saw panic flash across her face. She tried to keep control, to recite her lines, but something had slipped. A legal assistant closed the door softly behind them, and I realized the moment had come. Either she would fold, or she would fight. I had prepared for both, but I had not prepared for what she said next. She swallowed hard, and what came out wasn't the practiced denial I'd heard before. It was a hiss of anger, brittle and small. "You think you can ruin me?" she spat, voice shaking. "Do you know what I sacrificed for this family? Do you know what your father would have wanted?" Her words were a last-ditch performance. I'd heard versions of it before, but this time they landed on different soil. The lawyer, who had once moved through rooms like an insurance policy, stopped rehearsing. He glanced at the assistant, who was already typing, and for the first time in months, my mother's competence looked like sand. Outside the glass office, someone had already called in the bank's legal team. Within hours, the holds became seizures on selected accounts. The house was not sold. The signatures she'd produced were flagged for forensic review. The little network she relied on, the notary who'd verified documents, the realtor who'd expedited the sale, began to shrink away like frightened animals when the lights come on. And then came the calls Emma had prayed would never ring. Old lovers, men whose names had been whispered in corners of my mother's life. Liam had found messages that mapped out affairs not as moments of weakness, but as transactions, favors, introductions, kickbacks. Men who'd lined up to gain from her position. One by one, the names that once shimmered in my mother's life were now fingerprints on a ledger. She tried to bargain. She stammered, eyes wild. "Please, don't wreck the family." But the family had already been wrecked. Trust doesn't mend with a check. Justice isn't a private negotiation you can seal with perfume and false contrition. I felt no joy in hearing her beg. I felt an old, slow mourning for the woman she used to be and the monstrous stranger she'd become. The lawyer advised caution, civil suits, criminal referrals, acid recovery. The machine of accountability groaned into motion. Nobody moved faster or more ruthlessly than the financial institutions. They traced transfers, froze credit lines, and began clawing back what they could. My mother's new fiancé found himself ringless and exposed. Her allies receded into excuses. Her confidence, the very thing that had allowed her to believe she could erase me, evaporated under evidence and procedure.
Late that night, as I locked the study where Dad's papers still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco, I realized our war had shifted from hush to daylight. She had started a fight no amount of charm could win, and somewhere inside me, the part that had been paralyzed by grief began to thaw into something colder, a resolve not only to reclaim what was mine, but to make sure she could never hide behind our family's name again. There was one final move left, and I planned to make it count.
The weeks after the seizures felt like living inside a pressure cooker. Agents moved with quiet authority. Envelopes were stamped subpoena in black ink. My mother's phone went dead more than once, and her perfume-scented smugness gave way to something raw and animal, fear. But fear without proof is dangerous, so I kept adding fuel, methodically, coldly, like a surgeon closing on a tumor. Liam and I agreed it was time to make one final play. Not a public shouting match, but a carefully timed legal strike that would leave no room for misunderstanding. We'd prepare a packet so airtight the courts could not ignore it. A criminal referral, a civil suit for fraud and forgery, and a coordinated media blackout until the moment the clamp came down. No leaks, no sympathy pieces. If she wanted pity, she'd have to earn it in front of a judge, not in the living rooms of our relatives. On the morning the legal team served the complaint, I sat in the courthouse corridor and felt the world narrow to the soles of my shoes. My hands did not shake. They had learned steadiness in the months of waiting. The prosecutor's office moved faster than I expected. The charges, fraud, forgery, financial exploitation of an elder, read like a litany of betrayal on paper. In the prosecutor's eyes, I saw something like respect, and when she said, "We'll pursue this," relief washed through me, sharp and chemical. Word spread through family channels in a way that no well-meaning lecture ever could. Cousins who had once closed ranks with my mother began calling, offering statements, forwarding old emails that once seemed private. The network my mother had built to protect herself was unspooling. Allies sheepishly stepped forward with documents they'd saved, suddenly lucid about the oddities they'd once tolerated. The real sting, though, came when the probate judge ordered an emergency hearing to examine the contested will. The courtroom was lined with faces I had loved and grieved over. My mother sat still, small under the bright lights, clutching a handkerchief. When the judge examined the signatures and the timeline of transfers, the forgery expert, called by my lawyer, spoke plainly, showing the microscopic differences between Dad's genuine handwriting and the copies my mother had produced. At that moment, you could almost hear the air in the room change. People who'd whispered were now watching with nicked curiosity. Pity shifted into something sterner. My mother's mouth moved, but no words came that could undo the patterns the paper revealed. The judge sealed provisional orders to restore accounts and appoint a neutral trustee while the case proceeded. Walking out of that courtroom, the winter air felt clean and bright, like an incision that had been sutured. We'd won a battle, not the war. There would be hearings, appeals, and the slow arithmetic of restitution. But for the first time since Dad died, the scales had tipped in my direction. And I knew, with a cold certainty, how I would finish this, by forcing every hidden ledger into the light until there was nowhere left for her lies to hide. The days that followed the emergency orders felt surreal, like living inside a news cycle that I hadn't asked for. Reporters called once, twice, and then backed off when my lawyer reminded them of ongoing proceedings. But the quiet outside hid a storm inside. Inventories, subpoenas, forensic reports, affidavits. Every document they pulled up was another thread that led straight to her. My mother went through stages. At first, she mouthed denial, then bargaining, and finally a brittle animal fear when she realized institutions could be relentless. She started showing up to family gatherings with a face that said, "I'm innocent," but the eyes betrayed her. People watched her differently now. Whispers trailed her like a shadow. The women who had once complimented her jewelry now avoided her gaze. The criminal indictment arrived like a cold, clinical knock. Count after count, fraud, forgery, financial exploitation, each supported by a paper trail that Liam and our lawyer had dug out from under her.
The prosecutor moved with a steady hand. Plea deals were offered and rejected. Witnesses were called. My mother's allies either testified truthfully or invoked convenient forgetfulness. Watching her sit in the courtroom, small and frayed, was a pain that didn't feel like victory. There was one hearing I will never forget. A forensic handwriting analyst took the stand and, with the precision of someone reading DNA, showed how the signature on the revised will had been manufactured. Pressure patterns that didn't match my father's, pen lifts where there shouldn't be, and an ink composition that suggested it had been produced after his death. The room hummed. Even my mother's most loyal cousin could not meet her eyes. When the judge announced provisional restitution orders, freezing assets, returning certain accounts, appointing a fiduciary to manage the estate, my chest unclenched in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't the money I felt for so much as the correctness of the act. The law had acknowledged what I already knew in my bones. Trust, once weaponized, must be undone in public. Sentencing came months later. My mother received a custodial sentence and a restitution order. The word mother sounded strange as the gavel fell. I didn't cheer. I sat very still, letting the gavel's echo carve out whatever hollow was left. Justice, in its slow bureaucracy, had been served, but it did not stitch up the wound. After court, people told me I was brave. Some called me cold. My friends said I had courage. Others whispered that I had shattered a family. All of it was true. I had taken a monster's lair apart, but in doing so, I had cut family bonds I didn't know could be healed. That night, alone in Dad's study, I stacked the recovered ledgers and closed the drawer. The house felt quieter, less haunted. I had forced the truth into the light, and in that exposure there was a strange, terrible cleansing. The reckoning had come for her. For me, it was only the beginning of rebuilding.
The day the final papers were signed, the sun felt ordinary, too ordinary for what had happened. I stood in the kitchen where my father used to make coffee and watched sunlight strip across the floor. It should have felt like victory, but victory has its own strange, hollow taste when the cost is counted in broken family and prison bars. Legally, the estate was restored. The accounts that could be reclaimed were reclaimed. The house stayed in the family. The businesses my father built limped on with new oversight and a trustee who reported directly to an independent board. Liam's footage, the bank holds, and the expert testimony had done the work the rumors never could. The court's restitution order returned most of what had been taken. The rest became the subject of long civil wrangling. Money, we discovered, can be recovered. Trust, once burned, is another story. People told me I was brave. Some people called me ruthless. Both were true. I had to be ruthless to stop a ruthless woman. I had to be brave to speak the ugly truth aloud in a room where everyone remembered Mom as the lady who baked pies and loved Christmas carols. In the weeks after the trial, relatives who'd stayed silent began to speak. Apologies that were cautious, some unsteady attempts at reconciliation, and others stubborn silence. The family that gathered for weddings and funerals now met with a new, careful choreography. My mother's sentence was short enough for some to call mercy, long enough for others to call consequence. When I visited her once, the woman who met me across the visiting glass had the same eyes I had learned to read my whole life, only now they were full of a remorse that looked as thin as tissue paper. She mouthed words I could not trust. I listened because that's what daughters do, even when the daughter has become the accuser. It did not make the theft disappear. What I built from the wreckage was not just ledgers and legal safeguards. I created structures, checks, and balances that would prevent another person from ever walking into this house and slowly stripping it bare. Multiple signatories, periodic audits, a family trust managed by professionals, not personalities. I sat with the accountant who helped rewrite our policies, and for the first time in years, I felt something like calm.
I do not tell this story to revel in punishment. I tell it because the choice between silence and action is not a moral puzzle when your life is at stake. I tell it because shame is how thieves hide, and truth is how they're found out. Some nights, I still wake with my throat tight, remembering the casual cruelty of my mother's plan. Some mornings, I sip coffee in the yard and hear my father's laugh in the attic boards. If there's a final thing I learned, it's this. The person you raise can become the person who hurts you. That knowledge is a cross to bear. But it is also a compass. It pointed me away from forgiveness that would have left me ruined and toward a steadier place, one where justice, however imperfect, was at least served. I closed the study door behind me and set the lock. Not in paranoia, but in protection. The house still holds memories, and now, finally, a measure of peace.